Welcome to this episode of the Formula Podcast. Today, our guest is the author of The Kneeling Man, Leta Seletzky. Leta, I just have to say, when I picked up this book, I thought it was going to be like an interesting story and like some historical context, a good memoir, but I was not expecting what it was. And it was just, it was a story of your dad and his amazing life, plus like you've tied in some of your personal interactions with him. I was really just blown away by the whole thing, and I'm really excited to. I've been looking forward to this for like the last week, like diving into this conversation with you. So I just want to say thanks for taking the time. Thanks for writing like such a great book. And I guess just to kick things off, why? So I believe you touch on this in the book, but for those of who haven't read the book yet, why did you decide to write this memoir and this story?
Yes, and first I want to say thanks to you for thinking of me and of the Kneeling Man for this excellent podcast. It's a delight to be here to talk to you about it. But the reason that I wrote the book, it really came down to this question of legacy, which was something that came up for me once I started having children. And at the time that I had the idea to write the book and to delve into this story, I was a lawyer. I was a litigator down in Houston, Texas. I had already had one son, well, actually, no, I'd had two children by this time. I'd had one, and then I was on maternity leave, I believe, for the second one, and then subsequently went back to work part time. But I had these two children, and I'm thinking of, the fact that my father was now a grandfather. Granddaddy Mac is, what his grandfatherly name is. And I was wondering what I was going to tell my sons about their granddaddy Mac. And I knew that I really didn't know much about him and his life. And in particular, this very big event in his life that was also a part of American history. And so it just dawned on me that while I had been perfectly fine with running from the story and kind of living with this silence about my father and this hinging event that he was a part of, or at least on the scene for, that it wasn't fair to my children to pass down, that same silence and that sense of kind of trepidation about it. And so that is what led me to embark on this journey of learning and of research about my father.
Yeah. And the amount of depth to this story that there is to tell, like just putting all that together you said he sent you. So let me rewind a second. For everyone who hasn't read the book and doesn't know about the book, the historical event is your father was working for the Memphis Police Department. He was undercover with the following the invaders, right? And
That's
then
right.
he ended up being there the day that Dr. King Jr. was shot in Memphis. So, and then he was taken, a famous picture was taken, and that's kind of like I don't know if it's the main premise of the book, but that's like on the cover of the book. So, man, so you wanted to write this book to like, I don't know if is on not uncover necessarily, but maybe share the story to your family in your way versus them having to kind of wonder or carry that question with them. And it just seems that like, I don't know, I have so many questions. I don't even know where to start because as it's the book starts out with like your relationship with him, and then it kind of goes back in time to his experience. And as you're kind of telling that story, the like his experience growing up, I think a lot of us tend to think that that was like a long time ago, like when segregation and all those things were going on. And then when you read this, you're just like, it really wasn't that long ago. And his experiences, the stuff he went through was just very eye-opening. And then for him to take the path with like the police department that he did, it was just like, I don't know, you tell me, but it just seems like your dad had like just good fortune and also just like happenstance happen. I don't know if good fortune is the right word, but he had a lot of happenstance where he was just like at the place when something worked out. Like when he was at the academy the last day, or not the academy, the police department the last day that they were taking applications. And so I just find it fascinating. So my experience reading this, as you can tell, I'm like, whoa, this is nuts. But for you, like you writing it, how did you feel about it? Like what were your thoughts as you're kind of like putting together this story? What was going through your head?
Well, in putting together the story, I had to have a lot of conversations with my dad. I had to have a lot of interviews with him from October 2015 through I think it was February of 2022. So a long process, a years long process, of talking with him and just kind of unpacking and unpacking. And I mean, I was awestruck, kind of like you described, just the layers to the story and the events that seemed so uncanny, things that appeared to happen by happenstance, and yet one happenstance event led to the next happenstance event, and the stakes just got higher and higher as he went along. And so what I saw emerge in this story was this theme of destiny and kind of the shadowy hand of fate. I think I described it as in the narrative, and I think it speaks to how in every life we have a series of events that leads from one place to the next. And although we do have varying amounts of agency in these events, people are making choices each step of the way, and each choice leads to a road that leads to the next set of choices. There does seem to be beyond that a sort of providential element, I would say, or this element of fate and destiny.
Yeah, and it's relevant. It's like even when I was actually really shocked when there was a chapter two where there was somebody that was investigating him. I think they were gonna like accuse him of being a part of the assassination, and then he was like the lawyer that was in Jonestown, which was just like I like read that and I was like, how is all of this like it's all history, right? It's history you read about, and then somehow your dad is like connected to all these things, even like not directly, but even secondarily. It's just fat. Like I don't know how that happens, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, I was actually just blown away when I found out that yes, this lawyer was planning to show up in this congressional hearing and accuse my father of being complicit in Dr. King's murder. And it just so happened that this person was down in Guyana, and was caught up in the whole Jonestown
Hmm.
massacre, which, and I think it really does just kind of show how, history, before history is history, it is the now, and it's impacting things either in a primary or secondary way. And I mean, when all this happened, I mean, Jonestown now is, people know what that is. It's part of our kind of collective understanding. But at the time, when it was on the front page of the Washington Post, and my dad picks up the, post that morning and sees this headline about this massacre, people didn't know what Jonestown was, for the most part. It
Hmm.
wasn't, and so, yeah, I think there are so many moments in the story that are like this. And so I, was constantly amazed as my father is describing his life and all the intersections with other histories that take place in this narrative. I think it's quite astounding.
Yeah, it's I've never really read anything about anyone so connected to everything like this in this way. I think that's what's one thing that makes it such a great read, like reading this his story, is being able to connect it to all these events as they take place. And then also how I think it kind of ties into, I did have this question for you because early on you mentioned like your dad eventually goes on to work for the CIA, and then you ended up doing an internship there. So I wanted to know, like, man, I just have too many questions. I got to keep them in order. So he went on to do that, and then you ended up interning there. Was there some part of you could have gone down the same path? It seems like you went into law and everything. You could have done something similar, but it seems as if you took a bit of a different route. Did your dad's story or like his life impact that decision? I'm sure it helps you helped you get an internship there at the CIA, but then, yeah, I know that's more of a statement than a question, but maybe you can shine some light on that a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, back when I interned, they had what they called the summer employment program or summer employee program, something like that.
Mhm.
So, that was for the children of the CIA employees. So, yeah, but for my father's, working there, I would not have had that job. And yes, I could have gone down that same path that my father went down. At the same time, I was someone who, while I, at this time, because I was in college, I really didn't know that much about my
Mhm.
father's background, even at that point. But I was very much kind of socially aware and kind of plugged into more activist, not that I was plugged into activist movements because I didn't do much, but I was a sympathizer. I had read about, for example, the Black Panthers and Huey Newton, and I admired them. And then growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, as I did, the civil rights movement, so much, happened there. And of course, Dr. King's assassination happened there. And that always felt very present to me. I always grew up with a great awareness of, the struggle for equality, that Black people have been engaged in, from the beginning in this country. And so I knew that, the kind of career that I wanted was gonna, be something I wanted something that would allow me to express that side of myself. And so I kind of thought, CIA, it's a great resume builder. It will probably help me get into law school, but I just don't know if I'm really cut out for, national intelligence. I just thought, that's probably not for me. Funny enough, the internships, while I mean they were just kind of like, a typical federal government internship would be, I'm sure. I really enjoyed my time there. And I think the culture was great. People were friendly. It probably would have I think I would have been a good fit, looking back. But yes, I think it's also kind of interesting that in ways that I wasn't necessarily conscious of, I was following my father's path and also diverging in key ways from his path, not intentionally doing so. But for example, my father was a police officer before he went to the CIA. I, at a certain point, was briefly an assistant federal public defender. So on the opposite side of the courtroom from law enforcement. So, we were both kind of in this, world of criminal justice, but on different sides. He spent time in Africa, for the government. I spent time in Africa, but, with my husband for his corporate job. So, they're just different choices that I made because of, the context in which I grew up and, being a generation later, things that I knew and also privilege that I had that my father didn't have. But again, it also kind of speaks to this idea of fate and destiny in a way, and the fact that I wound up being the only person that my father shared his life story with and felt comfortable doing that, and having the ability to put together the book. I feel like everything that I did, from going to law school to having the life experiences that I had, prepared me to be able to tell the story.
Yeah. And it gives you a unique perspective too, because you actually have had the experience inside of like that realm a little bit. So you can, whereas somebody like me who has no law experience, no experience in government, I don't think I could tell the story the same way because I don't understand like the nuances, how the systems work, things like that. So it seems like it all worked out. So you were like perfect for retelling, like for telling his story. Now, I'm sure like putting this whole book together, there had to have been, like you said, there was the moment with the guy, the lawyer who died at Jonestown. Were there any other, like, what were the moments in the book, or maybe when you were reading what he sent you like a very large document and then you had to dig through it all? Were there any other moments where you were just kind of that really stand out to you, that were really impactful, that really either were shocking, inspiring, caught you off guard? What were the moments where you were just like, whoa, this is where you had some reaction?
I would say his early life.
Mm,
Growing up in Tibbs, Mississippi, born in 1944, one of 12 children, and actually, just his birth story, where he was born so prematurely that the midwife thought that he wasn't going to survive the night. And so, his mother was asleep after this arduous labor. And the midwife took him and wrapped him up in blankets and put him in a bread warmer above the stove in the kitchen just to try to give him a chance, and created this makeshift incubator. And she gave him a name because she said, no baby should die without a name. And so, just the fact that he survived as a preemie, black child in Jim Crow, Mississippi, with no access really, to decent health care. I was very much blown away by that, and I just kind of thought, to come into the world in that way, to have your life begin in such a tenuous way, to the point where the midwife named you because she didn't think you were going to live. That to me seems to be a life that is going to it seems like a life that is touched by fate.
Yeah. I can't even imagine like being in that room when I mean, I'm sure you've thought of this, but have somebody having a child and then putting them on top of like yeah, just to keep them warm. It's like, it just blows your mind to even think about that. And then as you said, he had like, that was a really tough time to grow up as, I mean, I'm sure as a family of, you said a family of 12, and then in Jim Crow, Mississippi, that just had to be, I mean, that I don't think people today could even fathom like how difficult that probably was and how challenging that probably was.
Exactly. I mean, when people think about, segregation and, the whites only water fountains and things, people tend to think of it as though it's, ancient history. It is really not. I am one generation removed from that. Both of my parents lived under, legal segregation. They attended segregated schools. And I mean, even, me, my generation, I remember in high school where at the beginning of the year, because of a federal court decision, desegregating the schools and creating busing, every year they had to tally up the racial makeup of the class to make sure that the schools were really desegregating, pursuant to the court order. And so, we would have to go through this survey and the teacher would ask, okay, now everyone who is white, raise your hand. And they would do, a count of hands. And then, all the black students, if you're black, raise your hand. And so, I mean, that is in my personal experience. And
That's so
so
crazy.
this is not long ago.
Yes. I mean, we were doing this. I'm visiting my family right now, and we are doing like it's not ancestry.com, but it's something like that where you kind of like break out your like family tree and everything. And it's like these events that we're talking about, like Jim Crow, segregation, all that, like even during like your dad's time and when he was born, you said 44. That's not that long ago. Like you can it's and I think that and we could I mean we could have a whole conversation about that and like progress and things because I do feel like you read oh you even referenced her in the book Maya Angelou. Her book is her really famous one. Oh, I can't think of it. It has the bird on the front.
Oh, I know why the caged bird sings.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and if you read like her story as a child and then like your dad's childhood and you realize, growing up, I grew up in a town in the Midwest of like 2,000 people, and there's like nobody here. So it's very small, very empty. And, I think when you read these accounts, it really changes your perspective on things. It's like you're almost seeing things through somebody else's lens and their experiences, and you're just like, wow, it's just like crazy to me that like people were treated this way, right? And that these things happened. And I just think you do a really good job of sharing it in a way that's like you're not really you do it in a way that's makes you feel like you're almost there and you're experiencing it, but you're it's not like I feel like you're kind of left to decide like what you think of it on your own. You're not like you should be mad because this happened. It's more like this is what happened and that's it.
Right. And it was really important to me not to write something that felt didactic or, this is
Yes.
an outrage,
Yes.
I just want to lay it out, and let
Hmm.
the reader walk through the story, as you said, and experience in a sense the events. And I think it's really important at a time, now where you have folks who are banning books. They want
Yeah.
to limit access, that children and even adults have to these stories. And I think it's important. It's more important than ever that we do have these narratives, that we share these narratives, because that's the only way really to get folks to, have an understanding of other people's experiences and have that empathy.
Yeah, and I think that's so important today as well as any other. I mean, it seems like with how things have been, like with social media, you basically like you have your interests, you have things you're into, whatever, so you just get fed more and more of that context or that worldview. I think it's important to always, whether it's what reading, watching. I just had just I did an interview over, was it over the weekend or last week, with the woman who made a documentary on Syrian refugees called Batata. And she was making a film about potato farmers, and then the Syrian revolution happened, and so it turned into the story of a refugee family. And I think so, like consuming things like that, even though like I'm not Syrian and I don't have those experiences, it opens up your mind to like a different perspective. You have more empathy. You can be like, well, maybe just because I haven't experienced it, I doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or I shouldn't do something to help, or I shouldn't limit that information at the very least to being shared. And I really hope nobody bans your book. I feel like it's kind of an almost an honor at this point to have it banned, but at the same time, it's like, you know what I mean, where it's like if they thought it was that disruptive that they wanted to limit telling of it, it just seems a little silly. Like kind of
Yeah.
like, well,
Exactly. I'm trying to slide into some curricula. Hopefully, actually, I'm working on an event with a high school. And so I'm hoping to, talk to some students in the new year. But I would like to get some events like that before, I mean, I just think that it's just not on the radar screens of the banners yet. So
yeah.
trying to do as much as I can.
To get on their radar.
Well, yeah, I guess. And essentially.
Yeah. So when you were putting together this story, what was that process like for you? Because it sounded like you kind of got the notes from your dad. You kind of started putting the story together. Plus, you're tying in your own experiences as you were. Like I thought the part where he went and met with can't remember the first guy's name, Mr. Young.
Oh, Andrew
Um,
Young. Yes.
Yes, that I thought that was just like, it felt like you were, because I loved how you shifted between the past and the present when you were writing it, and it felt like you were in the room, kind of seeing them interact with each other, which was very cool. So my question, in the process of putting this story together, like what was that process like for you?
It was a long process. And I mean, I definitely went into it with some trepidation, with some fear, because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what I was, potentially going to find out. And then there were just some basic things that I didn't know. And so, as you alluded to, I started off with a document from my dad. This was all kicked off by a phone conversation that he and I had when I was working part-time, down in Houston. And I just called him up, and I was pretty much, committed to, moving beginning this project and moving it forward. And so, having this very awkward phone conversation with him, like, "Hey dad, how you doing? Yeah, fine. Hey, we never talked about Dr. King's assassination." And he's kind of like, "Okay." And so he told me that what he would do is he would put together some notes, and he would send me those notes, and I should read them, and then we would go from there. And shortly after we had that conversation, he emailed me a Word document, 17-page document, Courier font, with his story. And so, I get this email, and I'm like, "Okay, here we go," and I start reading, and I didn't get more than 3 pages into that document before I decided I'm not ready to do this. And the reason was because, well, first of all, he started off with this preamble that was almost like boilerplate. And it's a little bit like, I have this statement at the beginning of my book, about how, this information has been reviewed by the Central Intelligence Agency to prevent the disclosure of classified material. Well, his notes began with this preamble that, he would be honest and forthcoming, but he would not betray the oath that he took, and he would not, betray his friends, something to that effect. And so I saw this boilerplate, and I'm just like, okay, why is this here? What am I about to read? And so I get past that, and then he goes into, the very beginning, 1944, Tibbs, Mississippi. He, names his parents. He names all of his siblings. He talks about the house that they lived in, and, the rented land, and, what they farmed. And he describes, his family members. And as I'm reading this, I'm getting a picture of everyone, and I'm getting a picture of this place. And it's very moving. And I can feel, this swelling of emotion, in my chest. But I'm like, okay, let's keep going. So, page one, page two. And then on page three, he gets to this anecdote, and it's his first encounter as a small child with white supremacy. And what happened was he was with his father, Walter. They had just come from the cotton gin and had gone to the general store to get some items. And when they approached the general store, there were three white men who were sitting, on the porch out front. So they walk past these men, go in, get what they need, and they come out. And when they come out, one of the men offers my father, who is, a small child, maybe four or so, offers him a cherry soda. And my father says, no, I don't want it, because he had always been told by his parents not to drink after people. And my father's father, Walter, becomes very agitated at this point and says to my dad, take it, boy, in a very kind of, angry way. And my father says, in these notes, he can't understand why he's being made to take this. And at that point, I just lost it. It was just so sad to me. And it was just a really wrenching story. And I just thought, well, what else am I about to read? And by the way, we're not even anywhere close to the assassination, which is, the main wrenching story that I'm expecting to read. And so I decided that I was not ready to go through all of these 17 pages of notes. So I took those notes, I closed out that document, and I did not open it again for 5 years.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing about the story is it's not, it leads with like the Martin Luther or Dr. King assassination, but that's only a small part of it. It's such a small part, and it's I remember that part in the book, and at first I was a little confused. I was like, why can't he take, like, why is he telling him to take the soda? And then I was like, oh, that sucks. Like, where it's because it was being offered by a white person where they were, it probably had been deemed like very insulting or something, or maybe his dad was worried about insulting him, and then they were just probably trying not to cause any problems or anything. I'm guessing, is that what you took from that as well?
That's exactly right, because, the law of the land was white supremacy. And so your life could literally be in danger by, insulting a white person. And so all the rules change when the racial dynamic changes. And
Hmm.
so, all the things that you thought about hygiene, all the things you thought about personal dignity, and just your boundaries, all that goes out the window in this context of, dealing with a white person.
Hmm. Yeah, and I just had kind of a random thought was with like even in man, this is an interesting realization. So I'm sure that a lot of like Black people in the South have grown up hearing these stories, experiencing maybe even experiencing these things still now, not on that level, but and then when there's some, I don't know how to say this, but there's some like something that happens where like a white person says something to a Black person where I can understand now how like a Black person would feel like, okay, this is like racially charged, because I think it's just how it was for a very long period of time when those interactions happened. It was just kind of like the status quo that whatever people that were in power in that white supremacy society, organization, however you want to call it, power structure, how that impacts perceived interactions in the future. Is what I'm saying making sense? I think it's making sense, but I'm not sure.
It is, no, because there's a context
Hmm.
that goes along with these interactions today, a long context. And so, that's why it's so important for all of us to kind of be aware and have this understanding, of the history, of the dynamics that have existed, in this country. And so, yes, even today, with interactions that may happen, there is a context behind those that can lead to issues.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like kind of an idiot that I'm just kind of like having this realization. Okay, so I'll move on. Um, so that was one piece of it. So you said like when he was born, like the whole process of putting it together when he was born, and then this interaction with it'd be your grandfather, right?
That's right.
Yep. And so were there any other parts that stood out to you where you were like you were surprised or taken off guard or had like an emotional reaction to it?
So much, so much. It's very difficult to choose. I understand, why you were saying there's just a lot of ground to cover. But
Yes.
I would say the part where my father is basically tricked into dropping out of high school to
Um,
join the army. And, he's thinking he's going to continue high school because that's what the recruiter told him once he gets into the army. And then he finds out that that is not the case. I thought that was profoundly sad. I thought it was also very surprising, but, the fact that he enlisted in the army so that he could pursue education, through the GI Bill. And ironically, this is what derails his education. And not only is his whole reason, or not whole, but, the main thrust of his reason for joining the army, not only is that undermined, but now, he's put his life on the line. He has now committed to serve his country. He cannot control where his life goes because of that decision. He could be sent anywhere. Vietnam is now starting up, so who knows? And the fact that he still has to be treated, or not has to, but is treated like a second class citizen after having gone through all of this. He's
yeah.
down in Georgia, I'm trying to remember the name of the base, but in any event, he's down there. The closest town, Augusta, is segregated. So he's still treated as a second class citizen, even though he has signed over his life in service to this country where he's being treated this way, and had done so because of a lie. I
Yeah.
found that quite astounding.
I think I phrased my question wrong. Was like, were there any other? It was more like, which ones were like the biggest? That was probably like the better question. And it seems like with these interactions he had, it's like with so I can think of a few others. Like that was one where the recruiter lied to him, and I guess he could have just got a voucher or something and still finished high school and then gone. And then I think when he joined the police force, and there was some stuff that happened then after he became like a spy, and then eventually I feel like there was some point in time where it felt like he was just kind of like noticing these things and just kind of filing them away and not reacting or doing anything about it. But then I felt like maybe when he was like hiring and recruiting for the bureau, I think that was the right organization, right? Was it
The CIA.
the CIA? Thank you. And then he started like doing things his way, and it felt like he was kind of standing up for the things he believed in and wanted to do, like throughout this whole time. That was kind of the impression I got. Did you feel the same?
I did feel the same, and I felt like I could see as time went on, he gained more freedom and more agency in what he was able to do as he went through the system. And I mean, it was really tough because there were things that happened that he knew weren't right, but there was little he could do about them without really leaving the career that he had set out to have. For example, in the police department, he saw injustice, but there was nothing that he was empowered to do to really correct it. However, because he stayed the course, he ended up getting to a position, at the CIA where he was able to suggest ways to recruit and retain people from marginalized communities. And he, went out and recruited and found these folks that, management at the agency was saying, they couldn't find. He went out and he did it. He found these people. And so, yes, I mean, as he stayed the course, he was able to, get some measure of authority and power to make change. However, he also paid a price for that.
Yeah. What was the price that he paid for that?
Well, he ended up not getting a promotion to the senior intelligence service that he, by all rights, should have gotten. And it was pretty obvious that
Yeah.
he had just rocked the boat too much.
Yeah, there was a point in there where he was getting like kind of written up almost for his recruiting methods, even though he was having successful results. And it kind of seemed like that. I don't know if that was the beginning where the issues started, or if that was just one of like the smoke signals that people weren't really approving of what he was doing. But when that happened, I mean, he stood up for himself. Like he was just like, no, like I'm not signing that report or whatever. And I feel like that takes, I don't know, I guess it just takes a lot of courage to be in that point and be like, and being like, no, these are my principles and I'm going to stand for it, even if it means I'm going to be punished or lose something or whatnot. So I just thought that was like it seemed like a small thing, but I thought it was impressive. It was kind of like just another like exclamation point on like him kind of taking, like you said, taking agency over what he was doing.
Exactly. It was a form of resistance. And to me, it highlights how, there are different ways of resisting the status quo and trying to make change, and these ways are going to look different depending on the context. I mean, certainly you had, the invaders who were very loud and they were outside of, systems trying to make change that way. You had Dr. King, of course, who was making change in his way and, because of that was murdered. But then, my dad's story, I think, is a story of working within systems to try to make change. And of course, there's always this, debate about whether these kinds of institutions, government or what have you, can be changed from the inside. And so this shows, how folks have tried to do that and how, this man in particular tried to do that and, what the change that he was able to make, but also the price that he paid for that. And so there's
Yeah.
always a price, when folks rock the boat, whether they're within systems or outside of systems.
Did he read the book when it
He
was done?
did.
Yeah. What did he say?
He loves it. He told me, so I sent him the manuscript when it was done, like the first draft.
Hmm.
And then we had a conversation. And, this was really like our last formal interview. And I said, so, you've read the manuscript and we've been talking about this since 2015. Is there anything else that, you would like people to know about, yourself, your life, the choices that you've made? And he said, everything that I want people to know is in this book.
Yeah. That's gotta feel really good.
It does. And when he told me that, like that moment, I knew that no matter what happens out in the marketplace, no matter what happens with reviews or whatever, this book is a success.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think that's what most people want in life is to like for their parents to be proud of what they've done.
Exactly. And to know that I told the story in a way that was, truthful, that was transparent, that was raw, not everything in there is pretty. There's a lot of ambiguity, but that my father said this is right.
Yeah. What do you think is if somebody reads this book, what do you think like the one takeaway that you and or your dad would like?
I think the takeaway is that in this society, and I would think in many societies around the world, that there are many ways to make change, no matter where you are. In relationship to your institutions, you have people who are trying to get free, whether they're working within societal institutions or outside of those institutions. There are folks who are, pushing in the ways that they can. And so resistance is going to look different depending on what your relationship to these institutions are. But there's always going to be a price to be paid. And that is the arc of history for Black people in America. And I would say the arc of history for all folks around the world who are trying to get free.
Yeah, I think that's a really good message to share too. It's like it's almost like no matter where you are, whether you're in the system or without of it, without of it, without outside of it, you can do what you can to make change, to like build the world that you want to live in, even if but also understand that it's not going to be just roses and sunshine every day. There's going to be challenges along the way, but at least from your dad's perspective and story, it's worth it.
Exactly. And I hope it prompts people to examine, who are they with respect to their institutions and their society, and what does resistance look like for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to ask myself that later on because that's as I don't know the answer off the top of my head. So I want to ask you some questions about just like writing and storytelling in general because I do think you put together something really special here, and I'm curious about like your process and how you did it. So when you would sit down, like so you started with this big Google Doc or Word doc or whatever, and you kind of had to turn it into this book, which is a lot more than 17 pages long. So if we're talking from like a technical standpoint, how did that work? Was it you got the doc, you started doing, you had more, well, you took some time, picked it back up again, started doing interviews, asking more questions to kind of fill in the blanks? I'm just guessing, but then what happened after that?
My process was probably somewhat unorthodox. So I got the document, I got the 17 pages. I read through those 17 pages, once, maybe twice. And then I set it aside again because what I wanted to do was internalize what was there, but I didn't really use it as kind of a basis for writing at all. And in fact, once I, read over it a time or two, I set it aside and I didn't pick it up again until really the end of the writing process when I was just making sure that I had, gotten things correct and also had hit the highlights. So yeah, so I, read through the information and then I started the interview process, which, my dad and I ended up getting into this rhythm where, 5 days a week, around an hour a day, we were talking, and I would have, a topic for each day. And so I did that over a period of years. But, I couldn't just take his word for, the story. I had to corroborate as much as I could. I had to do a lot of independent research. I had to understand something about the historical context of, what he was telling me. So when he and I were not interviewing, I was reading everything I could get my hands on about, Dr. King's assassination, about the sanitation strike, about the invaders, and these activist movements in Memphis, about the Students for a Democratic Society, about the Central Intelligence Agency, about the FBI and COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence program of dirty tricks against activist movements. So a ton of research. In addition to that, I had to try to get some documents from the government. And so, the obvious first place to begin would have been the Memphis Police Department in trying to get a hold of those files. However, I quickly learned that those files didn't exist because back in the 1970s, the police department incinerated all of its intelligence files. They burned them. And there was a lot of litigation about that. So the next best place to go was to the FBI. So I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request trying to get documents pertaining to my dad and his work. And I ended up having to go to, through the National Archives to get that stuff because it had been archived. And then I ended up in a little bit of an administrative, I don't want to say battle because it was all very amicable. And, the archives are great. Like those folks are, consummate professionals. However, there was some dispute about whether I was entitled to an expedited production of those documents. And so I was able to file an administrative appeal of their denial of this expedited production. And I won that appeal. So, there's kind of a little, almost legal battle that went on in the middle of this. And so I'm constantly reading, I'm talking to my dad, and then I'm trying to, mentally synthesize everything. And then, I start kind of outlining, what is the story, outlining chronologic, what am I having to cover? And then trying to figure out from a storytelling perspective, what is going to best communicate narratively for the reader, because I don't want this to read like, the encyclopedia. I want this, I don't want it to be kind of, a dry set of facts. I want it to feel like, you're there. I want it to feel really kind of like a novel, and that's where the creative side of creative nonfiction comes in. And so I had to figure out, how am I going to structure the story? And then also, how am I going to weave in my personal perspective with my dad's experiences? And so I had to really kind of figure out just structure. And so once I had kind of that outline, I just started filling in and just started writing based on, what I knew and what was in the transcripts of my interviews with my dad, what was in those FBI documents, what I had researched and learned, and I'm like, at one point I had footnotes, which my editor was like, we don't need the footnotes. So I took those out. But just to make sure, every line I wanted to have some kind of authority for what I was saying. And that's kind of the legal side coming out too, like making sure, everything is like, fact checked as diligently as I was able to do. And so that was the process. And so when I wrote, I really tried to sit down and just tell the story. Like, if, I'm sitting here talking to you, how would I tell this story to someone? And then going back and just, double checking the facts, weaving in, information from all these other sources. And that really was the process.
Yeah, and there's so much to that in the book itself. Like there's so many little details on. I think there was. I mean, there's so many dates, names of people, people who were leaders in organizations, what was going on that year. There's just so much tied into it. It's so much more than just like. And then my dad went and applied for a job at the police station, went through this process. You're giving so much context along the way. You're like, here's what was going on that made this little fact important. Like you tied in the Emmett Till story and to like what when your dad was growing up. And once you tie that in, it puts a lot more weight to what's happening. You're like, oh, that's when that was. That's when that was going on. So you're just like, okay, like that's actually really serious. What just happened? It seemed like a little thing, but then just not that far down the road, Emmett Till thing happens. Well, not the thing, the Emmett Till lynching, right?
Yeah.
Or
Hmm.
yes. So you realize that just it could have just as easily happened to anybody else in that period of time once you read that little contextual snippet. And yeah, so I think you did an awesome job with that as well.
Thank you. I was really, yeah, I wanted to show kind of how things like, Emmett Till's murder personally affected people and show how, the shadow of death was constantly hanging over Black people in this society.
Yeah. And it goes, you mentioned the J. Edgar Hoover dirty tactics where like even I'm having a hard time remember his first name, Mr. Young. When he was saying he found wires in his house in like the 2000s from before. I guess I'm assuming he lived in that house for a very long time, but he's finding like wiretaps left over from those periods of time, which is just wild to even. I mean, can you imagine you're just like doing some housework and you find a wiretap?
Yes.
It's I It just feels like a very surreal feeling.
That was another one of those facts that I was really surprised to hear. The way that he just casually spoke about how the FBI was listening to his phone calls and how even into the present day that affected his life. Putting in, I think it was a fence he had put in, and the folks who were digging found, all these extra wires. And how, even when his current wife would talk on the phone to her friend, there would be an echo on the line. And so these are just kind of the current day effects of these tactics that were used so long ago.
Yeah, and how do they install an extra line in your backyard without you knowing about it? That's like another question I had. Where I'm like, if you on vacation, they're like digging up your backyard, or what's going
I'm
on?
very curious how they would have done that. And if I recall correctly, there were some FBI folks who had taken up residence in a house, down the street or in in the neighborhood. So,
Hmm.
who knows? Maybe they came disguised as like, workers from the phone company, that kind of thing. But it just shows you how pervasive this was and how, all encompassing, if you wound up in the crosshairs of the FBI, then, you really couldn't get out of it. So,
Yeah, it sounds like, especially during that time where the leader of the FBI had such a, would cult of personality be accurate, where his approach to things just his personal approach just kind of ran down throughout the organization, where they became like obsessed over certain groups of people, activists in particular, and just kind of did everything they could to really, I don't know what the right word is, just to like undermine them, monitor them, assassinate them, whatever
right.
the, I guess depends on the person. But it's, yeah, it was just such a, just all of it together is just, I don't know. It's just hard to wrap your head around all of it. But I have a couple questions from like a personal standpoint about from myself to you as a storyteller. So I've done some writing, made some videos. I've done some like I wouldn't even call them documentaries. They're like YouTube videos about like different people I found inspirational that I've met around the world. Oh, I would love to also hear about your time in Kazakhstan because I've done tons of solo traveling and I've wanted to go like visit all like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all the stands, and I haven't yet, but I really would love to. That's probably a whole nother conversation. But as a storyteller, what advice do you have to somebody who, whether it's they want to write a book, make a documentary, tell a story in some way, as someone who did it in such a personal way, like what advice do you have to somebody who is thinking about telling a story that they truly care about?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the fact that you feel compelled to tell a particular story is a huge indication that that story is important and it does need to be told. And so just keeping, in your mind that this matters and that, the story that you want to tell, is valuable. I think that's a great way to start, just with that fundamental understanding. And then, as you set out to, to document this narrative, whether it's on paper or, on a video, in a documentary, what have you, I think just, well, first of all, just, from a practical perspective, working in scenes, because, stories can be so big. Like I felt like this story was so big that if I thought about the whole story as one unit, it felt overwhelming. However, if I just took it one scene at a time, then it became manageable. So I would say just, break things up into scenes and just, convey the story as if you were talking to a friend. Tell the story and then, that will guide you into, what information is needed, what information perhaps is not needed, and sort of, how you would shape the story. Because I feel very strongly that storytelling is something that is innate to being human. Human beings have always told stories, and they have helped us to understand who we are and to understand the world and our place in it. And so I feel that we all have, an innate ability to tell a story. So I would say, tap into that innate ability that we have and just try to convey this story in scenes as you would be talking to a friend, and, just kind of approach it that way.
Okay. So after you have like the scenes put together, what's your process after that?
Once you have all the scenes and you've got it all laid out, then, you're essentially in the editing, part of the story, which I personally love. I love having a rough draft to edit. Then I would say the objective is to make it cohesive. So, you've got all these scenes, you want them to fit together in a way that flows. And so then just trying to organize those scenes in a way, that flows best, that makes logical sense, that makes the story understandable, and that makes all these smaller units into one cohesive unit.
Yeah, there's a concept in storytelling where it's like you might understand it in your head and be able to visualize it, but the other person has to be able to see it in a similar way that you do. And I think that's kind of what you're saying is like kind of cut down all out all the extra stuff and make sure it's easy to understand. Like edit it into something that's painting the same picture that you want them to receive.
That's exactly right. And, I actually have found, visual media to be really instructive in, telling a written story because, oftentimes I'll look at a painting and, the painting isn't necessarily in fine photographic detail. There'll be a suggestion of a chair or a door or a shadow, and just the way that the light, hits particular objects. You're given, a scene is presented, but you don't have to have every little minute detail. And in fact, it will take away from the overall picture if there's, too much or if there isn't enough. So, just figuring out how to paint the scene in a way that's, conveying, the picture you want to convey, but, not necessarily having every little detail. Sometimes you just need a sketch or a contour. And that's really going to depend, very much on what the particular story is, but just kind of figuring out how to paint those scenes for the reader.
Yeah. There's a, I'm trying to think of who the author is, but they try not to use a lot of names for places or for characters because they find that if you say like this is Jeff, then it's like you kind of know, like you can maybe you know someone named Jeff, so now you are associating their name with the character. So it's more like they try to leave it a little more vague, so you can kind of they let the reader use their imagine. They like basically give them a space to use their imagination within the story. So instead of saying like he was 5'11" with a bow tie and jeans and all this stuff, it's like leaving a little room for imagination. I think it's all just it's like art though, right? It's like everybody kind of does it a little bit differently, and as long as the reader gets out of it what you're intending, or maybe not, maybe it's something where you kind of leave it up to the reader to decide for themselves what the meaning of it is.
Yeah, I think writing, or telling a narrative in any way, it's very much a two-way conversation. Or I think the most effective writing is a two-way conversation. So, as you said, leaving room for the reader, their imagination, I think is very important because I think that, as the reader is, taking in a narrative, they're bringing something to that process. And I think just leaving room for that dialogue between, text and reader is very important.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say to somebody who is, they have the story, they want to tell it, maybe they're trying to find the courage to do it. Like what would you tell someone that's, they have it in their head, maybe they have it on paper and they're just looking for that little burst of courage or motivation to get it started or get it done. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say, and this kind of goes back to that fundamental idea of if you feel compelled to tell a story, that means that that story matters. And it could very much be the case that if you don't tell it, it won't get told. And a story that doesn't get told disappears, it's lost. And the idea of losing a story to me, I find very tragic. And so I would say to that person, you could be the person who ensures that this story survives and is preserved. And if you don't tell that story, will it disappear from the world?
Yeah. It's almost the exercise of, imagine a world where this story is told and does get picked up, and imagine the impact it could have on some people. And then now imagine a world without it. Like which one is more meaningful to you?
That's right. And you never know where a story will go. Your story could inspire someone to tell something else, which inspires something else. And that whole chain goes away if your story
Mhm.
doesn't exist.
That's a really good point because it's what was that movie? It's like Butterfly Effect or something like that. I feel like that was such an old movie, but or not that old, like in the 90s, early 2000s, or no, not 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Um, but yeah, it's like if you tell your story and the impact it has could ripple, and that you don't really know until you try either, because it
Right.
could morph into something completely different. I'm sure when you started this book, you probably didn't imagine that this would be the exact final thing. And maybe you didn't even know it was going to be a book when you started. You were just like, you just wanted to know what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting and I look back on this and think, gosh, perhaps this was naivete, but when I initially asked my dad, or told him that I wanted to know his story, I at the same time had this idea that it would be a book, in the sense that I thought whatever he tells me, good or bad or indifferent, it needs to be documented. However, you're right. I mean, I never imagined that it would turn out to be that book with that cover. And I mean, even the title of it and the way that it came together. I mean, this is my first book. This is my debut book. And so, and I'm not a historian. I hadn't, I didn't have like I had some publications under my belt, but no, long form narratives in this way. Yeah, it feels miraculous.
Yeah, I think you did a very good job. I mean, I read a lot of books and I'm not an expert on writing or anything, but just from all the stuff that I read, there's some things you read and you can tell whoever wrote them cared a lot. And it feels like you cared a lot about this book and put a lot of effort into it. So it's a very good book. And I hope whoever you are listening that you decide to check it out. So what's your number two book? What's your next book going to be?
My next book, I am working on a novel as we speak, and I'm very excited about it. It is also set in Memphis. As you can see, Memphis is a place that haunts me. And so, and it's interesting because even though it is, it's fiction, it's a novel, I feel that there is some overlap with the kneeling man and kind of the context of that. And so I am telling the story of a Black woman who is a rookie reporter at a Memphis newspaper. And I'm hoping to kind of, through her experience and through kind of the narrative that happens in the scenes that unfold, I'm hoping to tell the story of, the rise and the fall of print journalism and the consequences of that and the implications, not only for, a city, but also for democracy.
Yeah, well, you'll have to let me know when it's done and you can come do a round two and then we can talk about your experience writing that book as well. I'm sure it'll be great and I look forward to checking it out.
Oh, I appreciate that. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to be respectful of your time. So before we wrap up though, is there any requests, any last words of wisdom, anything you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, I would say to the listeners, just remember that your stories matter. Do not be afraid to delve into them and preserve them. And I would say, particularly with respect to, our elders, in our community, whether it's your relatives or people that I think it's very important to, to gather their stories. And, I think that you will probably be amazed and astounded by the things that they've seen and experienced. And so to the extent that you can preserve those stories by recording them or writing them down, I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think I cannot emphasize that point enough because I mentioned earlier, my grandma just passed away, but she documented everything. When my grandpa was alive, she wrote down his life history, and then she wrote down her own life history. And when her mom was alive, she wrote down her life history. So when she gave them to us when I was like 19, I was like, "Ah, who cares?" And then now I'm 35 and I'm like, they're just like precious documents that I'm so glad that she took the time to put together. It's just an interest. You almost get to like travel back in time and see things from the perspective of a relative who maybe isn't here anymore or won't be here in the future. So I think it's so important to capture those stories too.
That's so wonderful and so beautiful that you have that. And you're right, that's priceless. There was a famous writer, who said that, we are trying to capture things that are not Googleable. So these types of stories are not Googleable. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really precious that those stories and those notes that you have.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone interview your grandparents while they're still around.
Yes.
Get these stories because I mean I don't know if it sounds like maybe your parents were the same way when you were younger. You didn't ask a lot of questions and they didn't tell you much. Then when you're older and you know what questions to ask, you just never know what you're gonna find.
That's right. And then, I think it's also a generational thing where, the previous generations just did not talk about so much. And sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get certain information. But I just think, if you just start off with, having them tell you something, fun for them to talk about, their, funny memories and things like that, and
Yeah.
just kind of easing into it, I think that can help people open up.
Yeah, I have on my phone from years ago. I don't know why I was doing this, but I remember asking my grandparents, like, what was your first date like with grandpa or grandma? And then they're just like, oh God, here we go.
That is a
Um,
great opener. Yes.
yeah, because their reaction says it all, and it's just also entertaining too, because you get to laugh at their discomfort a little bit, which is always fun.
Yes.
Cool. Well, I will wrap things up here, Lita, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. I think this was a really fun interview. I got to learn a lot about your dad, plus your own creative process, and I just want to say thanks for taking the time today.
You are very welcome. And thanks to you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this book. And I truly appreciate it.